Should we all be striving for 10,000 steps a day? Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Truth Talks, the podcast that brings you real strategies for sustainable fitness transformation. We are back with what we think is a hot topic. It's all about steps. So we're going to keep on walking today and just walk you through the value of steps and what they can actually represent for your fitness journey. Alrighty, so before we dive into the fitness aspects of things, let's just talk about steps in general. So steps, overall health, it's something that they naturally fit together. Paris, can you provide us with your POV on steps and walking?
Yeah, so I think humans were made to walk. And I think we've gone to this really sedentary lifestyle and we've normalized a super sedentary lifestyle, but I don't think that humans were made to sit down so much. And I also think that you will just feel so much better and you'll also be way healthier. And there's data to support this in terms of like tracking all-cause mortality or just like, pretty much all causes of death over time as you age. And people that just tend to fall towards more steps in a certain range tend to live longer. So I think it's really important, not only from manipulating body composition, which we can talk about later, but also just from a health and mental perspective. There's also a lot of data showing there's a mood stabilizing effect with a walk. Even a 20-minute walk can really have a great mood stabilizing effect.
I think we'll all remember, like, during peak COVID, it was like going for a stupid walk for my stupid mental health, and it became an internet trend. But yeah, it's also the truth. I think when we look back at those moments when all we really had was walking and the benefits that it brought and how much more we sought it out when we didn't have as many options. When you said humans were meant to walk, yeah, we're meant to walk for our mental health and for our physical health. And it's the original form of cardio, right? And I think for cardiovascular health, oftentimes we think, oh, well, I have to do this. I have to get my heart rate up to extreme, or I have to do this high intensity thing. But not necessarily. Like, if anybody has actually monitored their, heart rate during walking, you still get it up enough, right? And it is actually a really nice way of training your heart health. And as you said, all-cause mortality, cardiovascular health is a major contributor to long-term chronic illness. So managing that through walking is super effective.
Yeah. Also, something overlooked before we move on is like even just digestion wise, like a 10-minute, 15-minute walk post meal can also just help with glucose control, especially for people that maybe lack, insulin sensitivity, or if you have diabetes or different things like that. Like even just a small walk can do such a massive difference. So just something for people to think about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not necessarily your overall health experts. We're here to focus on fitness, but fitness and health go, hand in hand. We can't neglect the overall health when we talk about our fitness and our well-being. Walking and step counts represent NEAT. And NEAT is a form of energy expenditure and exercise. Can you just define NEAT for us and talk about how steps fit into our total daily expenditure?
There's a few different components of total daily energy expenditure, and one of the main ones is NEAT, which stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is just a fancy way of saying things that are not, traditional exercise that still contribute to calorie expenditure that you would do throughout your day. So, for example, me, doing this with my hands right now, if you're on video, you can see that, or me, doing dishes or walking my dog or fidgeting or dancing in the kitchen because my favorite song's on. Like those are all contributors of NEAT. And I think people greatly underestimate the power of NEAT, which is why we're talking about steps today.
Where does NEAT fit in if you were to quantify it against our total daily expenditure? How much do we rely on NEAT? I can burn calories by running around the block. I can burn calories by doing my groceries. What's the relative difference between the two?
So in terms of how much NEAT contributes to our overall daily expenditure, it's going to land somewhere between 15 to 20%. However, it can vary quite a bit depending on your lifestyle. Like, for example, if you work construction during the day, your NEAT is going to be significantly higher than somebody who maybe just sits at a desk all day.
Right, that's a good point. Rough guidelines, it's around that 20%, but the range is really, really big depending on your individual lifestyle. And why do we care about NEAT? Like if we're talking about body composition and, fitness goals and physique goals, Why does NEAT matter if we're already training and we've got a training program that we're following and we're monitoring our food? Where does NEAT fit into that equation?
It's a good question. So in terms of calorie expenditure, resistance training doesn't actually burn as many calories as people think it does. But NEAT can actually make a significant difference on your daily expenditure. And when you put that over the course of the week, it's a massive difference in, your ability to create a calorie deficit if your goal is fat loss, or even just maintaining a leaner physique, or keeping your rate of gain in a gaining phase slower. A NEAT makes a gigantic difference. So it is something that we need to quantify. And I think a lot of people in their fat loss phases, they don't have a way of quantifying it, which the easiest way is just quantifying your steps. That will give you a rough idea. It's not perfect, but it's an easy way. But a lot of people don't even talk about it. And then during their fat loss phases, they get a bit lazy because, things slow down when you're losing fat. And then all of a sudden your NEAT drops off a cliff and you're like, oh, why do I have to go even lower with my calories? It doesn't make sense.
It is one of those ways that we keep our daily expenditure up, right? And that can help make it easier to monitor the calories in, calories out equation, right? And we don't have a way to say we burned this many calories over the course of our day in a way that's really precise. That just doesn't exist. But when we can think about NEAT, it's about how are we staying active outside of our training to keep consistent calorie expenditure from one day to the next. So for anybody who kind of doesn't have the background knowledge, when we're thinking about any sort of body composition change or change in your physique, whether that's weight loss or weight gain or weight maintenance, the role of calorie balance is integral. That is the core driver. And calorie balance is essentially the difference in the equation between the calories you burn and the calories you intake. So if we think about NEAT as driving, let's say 20%, even though we know it's a range by person, of your calorie expenditure in a day, that will then relate to how much food you can eat to stay within that balance, or how you tilt that equation in favor of calorie surplus or calorie deficit when it comes to actually monitoring your net calorie intake for the day.
And I think it's definitely an underrated underrated tool that people just don't track enough.
And you kind of alluded to this already, but I do want to bring it up again, is that NEAT is everything, right? From fidgeting and doing your groceries and things. But you said that steps is kind of like that thing we actually can monitor, right? And I think it's hard to imagine a lot of ways of NEAT where we're not walking because any sort of movement, usually we're carrying ourselves, those of us who are able-bodied, right, of course, are carrying ourselves through steps, right? So steps becomes that representation of your non-exercise activity. So step counts then become that way that we are tracking and monitoring how we move throughout the day and how we stay active. I alluded to this idea of like calorie balance and, how NEAT contributes to that. Let's get specifically into the talk about steps and steps for fat loss. In your experience, working with lots of different people and coaching them through their fat loss journeys, what role do you see steps playing for them when it comes to their fat loss goals?
Yeah, so we have a few different levers we can pull in terms of creating a calorie deficit. One of them, the two main ones are food and then expenditure, right? And again, people tend to overestimate how much lifting actually contributes to your expenditure. It's really not as much as people think. So we have two main levers in terms of nutrition and steps. And I find that most people need to find their sweet spot between a calorie intake that's sustainable for them, but still helps, put them in a range for fat loss. And then also an amount of steps that is sustainable, but also helps create, again, a calorie deficit. So you're kind of managing those two key variables. And those are two really easy to manipulate variables that can be adjusted with not that much effort. When we're in a fat loss phase, or again, as we're saying, if you're maintenance or building phase, like these are the same equation, right? Just different phases.
So what are the pros and cons for people when it comes to using steps for their fat loss goals? So let's start with the pros.
So obviously we talked about the health benefits and the kind of psychological benefits or mental health benefits of walking. But also I think something that people don't think about is the ease of implementation. I can easily just walk up and down my condo or park farther away, or we'll talk strategies later, but it's very easy for me to add steps to my day without me having to, I got to go to the gym and do cardio or something, right? So just expenditure that's super easy to add into your day. And it also doesn't really have much impact on two things. Number one, your recovery from weight training, which should be, your main thing that you're using your energy resources for. If anything, it could help with recovery. And secondly is your appetite. It doesn't have a huge effect on appetite, because a lot of other forms of expenditure via traditional cardio, running, etc., really spike your appetite. which unfortunately makes it a lot harder for you to stick to your calorie deficit when you're hungry. I don't know if anybody's ever done like a big run or a big sports game, or maybe you did, a circuit class at a gym or something like that. And you get home and you're like, I am ravenous. I can eat everything in the fridge. Not a great situation to be in when we're in a fat loss phase. So steps make it easy to get extra expenditure in, low impact. If anything, it's going to help with recovery, and not a huge appetite spike. Sometimes it has even an appetite blunting effect in certain times.
So what I'm hearing is that it's kind of actually about resource management when it comes down to it, right? Resource management from a recovery perspective. If you only have so many calories that you're intaking and you want to direct some of them also to recovery between sessions, then you're preserving some of that instead of directing them elsewhere. Elsewhere being, those intensive cardio sessions. And then also resource management in the sense of like keeping your finite resources finite, right? And not making it more challenging to stick to a calorie deficit or more tempting to kind of, to your point, eat whatever's in the fridge. So steps are a really great way that we can utilize our resources effectively for fat loss, but also still stay on track with the goal by increasing expenditure in a way that's sustainable. That sounds great. So what about some of the I'm going to say trade-offs. I don't really like the word cons because, we make our choices intentionally, but there are trade-offs to steps. The first one that comes to mind for me sometimes is time, right? And I think time is a barrier we're all confronted with at some point in our journeys, but steps can sometimes take time, whether that's, your desire to go for a walk or even just getting up and spending 5 minutes between meetings or whatever it is moving. And as you said, we'll talk strategy shortly. Stay tuned. But what are some of the other trade-offs that people have to make in order to include steps?
There's not too many cons, in my honest opinion, because there's always strategies and workarounds, which, as you said, we'll talk about. But I think time is the biggest one. And then secondarily, sometimes there's restraints based on practicality. So let's say, I am sitting down all day. It's like, oh, shoot, I have to make a conscious effort to go and get my steps in. However, I would have to make an even bigger conscious effort if I did a traditional form of cardio as well. But in this case, maybe weather is, it's cold outside and now it's harder for me to get my steps in, or, I live in a condo and, I can't just walk around my house because you feel like a crazy person walking up and down the kitchen, those types of things. But in all honesty, not too many downsides. I think those are the only two I can think of.
So yeah, your feet do go with you everywhere. So from a practicality standpoint, there is a pro there, which you alluded to earlier. It's like we can make it happen because we have the equipment with us. But the flip side of practicality is actually making that conscious effort within your lifestyle. Did I capture that?
Yeah. I think when we talk about time, I'll just throw this in as well to play devil's advocate. From an efficiency perspective, theoretically speaking, you could achieve a higher calorie expenditure with other traditional forms of cardio in lesser time comparatively to steps.
But then if you do that, you are then, potentially spiking hunger or having to go to the gym instead of just, if you're taking the time to drive to the gym to then go do treadmill or an elliptical or whatever it is, you could have actually spent that extra, 15 minutes just walking, and then it's kind of a moot point, right? We talked about tracking steps as important. We know why it's important to track steps and what role that fits in with a fat loss goal. What about if you have other goals, though? If you have other fitness goals, because fat loss isn't the only thing. If you just kind of want to maintain a healthy lifestyle or maintain your weight, or if you're in a gaining phase, how does steps play a role in each of those two phases?
Good question. So at maintenance, I think a lot of times, including myself, people have a tough time maintaining. It's either we're gaining or we're losing. And I think when we're in a maintenance phase, having a higher step count or having a regulated step count can give you a little bit more buffer in terms of your calorie intake, which can make things sustainable a little bit more. Like, I can eat obviously quite a bit more calories if I'm doing 10 to 12,000 steps a day as an example, compared to if I was only doing 2,000, which just makes it a little bit easier for me to maintain my weight if, I'm able to eat a little bit more and without being in a surplus. And then same thing in a building phase, I think a lot of people gain too fast. So what happens is if we can regulate our step intake, it gives us a way of kind of controlling that rate of gain a little bit more, and also staying healthy in our building phase. Because sometimes when we don't do any cardio type stuff in our building phase, sometimes cardio can actually be a limiting factor in our resistance training. So let's say I do a set of high rep leg press, but my cardio is giving out before my muscles are. Not something we want. So that's just another kind of spin that a lot of people don't think about.
And no matter what phase you're in, there's a reason we started with the fact that there are health benefits to steps and to walking, right? No matter what phase you're in, yes, we might have physique goals, but fitness does also rely on our health and wellness. And I said that throughout this podcast, making sure that some of those bare minimums are met. And I also really appreciated what you said about sustainability in a maintenance phase and giving us that buffer to sustain our approach to eating in a way that gives us flexibility, but also sustain kind of that healthy lifestyle element of fat loss that we might have achieved through a fat loss phase, rather. So let's say we started integrating steps because we wanted to lose body fat, but there's also potentially a risk in like, okay, now we switch into maintenance phase. Cool, I don't need to do that thing because it was only to help me lose weight, right? That's not necessarily true because you do need to maintain or sustain the outcomes, right? Depending on how, the degree to which you lost body fat. If you're a competition prep, you don't want to stay there. But if you are just looking to sustain that lifestyle and that body composition that you achieved as a general population, then that steps allows you to do that. It allows you to maintain that and also maintain some of the habits that were critical to getting you there. So part of it, I think, does come down to just consistent, healthy habits. Tracking steps, that's what this is all about. The number that we always hear is 10,000. Can we just break that down a little bit? Like, where does 10,000 come from? Like, I've heard that 10,000 came actually from like, I got to do more research on this, so I'm not including a citation here, but that it came from some Japanese company trying to sell a technology or something like that, right? But regardless of where it came from, it's actually out there for us to talk about, this 10,000 steps. Is that the mandatory? Should we all be striving for 10,000 steps a day?
I think a lot of times, hey, doing 10,000 steps a day can make fat loss a lot smoother or make it easier to maintain or make it easier to have a slow rate of gain when you're building. That's definitely a great number for a lot of people, and a lot of times people do land somewhere around that range for their step goal. In the context that we were talking about. However, it's just an arbitrary number, and if you're only doing 3,000 steps a day right now, it's probably not realistic for you to jump all the way up to 10. So I think a lot of times, if we bring down the range to like 6 to 10, is usually a pretty good sweet spot for most people. On the higher side, 10 to 12 steps is usually pretty high, because there's also diminishing returns with kind of more steps as we get into like really high step counts. There's a really diminishing return. So I think like most clients end up somewhere between that 6 to 12 range, if I had to say. And if we're talking about the health data in terms of all-cause mortality, there's a pretty exponential benefit to steps from like 0 to 6K, but it kind of starts to level off after 6K. So I would almost say like 6 to 10K is probably where I would land for most people.
So we can think about it in terms of a minimum instead, right? It's not necessarily giving us a specific, we have to hit 10,000 steps, but it's thinking about, is my minimum at least around that 6K? Because regardless of fitness goals, health-wise, that's where we want to be playing. I've also seen charts related to that all-cause mortality that show additional benefit from like 6 to 8K, and then it starts to taper. So I think we have a lot of confidence that 6K is that minimum. But I liked your point about if you're at 3,000, shooting for 10K is not realistic. All it's going to make you do is like feel kind of defeated, and then also make you question where in the world you're going to find 7,000 steps from, right? So I do want to kind of talk a little bit about strategies to help people start to increase their step counts. However, before we dive into that, I do want to go back to a point you just made about diminishing returns. What do you mean by that? So if somebody is like, they're at 12,000 steps a day, and you're saying there's not a ton of extra benefit of like 15, 16, 17, can you expand on that a little bit?
So, some of it is just patterns I've seen with clients. It's not like we see like a massive difference in, for example, fat loss when we're dealing with like 12K steps versus like 14, 15. So that's one thing. Secondly is the amount of extra time compared to the return on time that we're getting is also low. So those are like the two main things. Also, I do think that there is, and again, this is some bro science mixed in with a little bit of real science. There is some compensation from your body in terms of mechanisms. Like there's also a lot of data saying like, okay, if I do a bunch of cardio, the rest of the day I tend to be a little bit lazier subconsciously, and I do think that effect starts to come in once we start dabbling with some really high step intakes, or sorry, step counts, whatever.
Step intakes. Give me the steps.
Yeah, let me eat all the steps.
Let me eat all the steps. Yeah. Well, the steps will eat you first, probably. So, what about people who naturally have really high step counts, though? Right? Because some people, you alluded to this earlier, if they work in construction, they work other jobs where they're on their feet. Is there any? This is going to sound like a stupid question. Bear with me. Is there any quote unquote detriment to them living a lifestyle where their step counts are naturally super, super high?
I don't think so, but what you do have to think about for people that work a lot of manual labor, your training has to be organized very specifically in a way to manage the fatigue costs, especially if you're doing manual labor that's not just steps. It's like, lifting things, twisting. We've had quite a few clients who work in construction or manual labor or landscaping. And the way you program for those clients has to be a little bit more strategic. You have to take into account volume requirements and also specific movement patterns that might give you a little bit more bang for your buck in terms of good stimulus on the muscle, but not a lot of fatigue. Maybe you do less axial loading exercises, which just means compression of the spine and different things like that if they're doing a lot of heavy lifting at work, just so that the overall fatigue demand is not as high. And then also for those people, you're probably not going to play with their step count. It's just going to land high. It is where it is. And you're going to talk about other variables like manipulating their intake for making adjustments.
It all comes down to the physicality, right? The fact that steps are a physical demand and often associated with other physical demands. So when you introduce a third component of physical demands through training, you have to really think about how those two things, or three things rather, all work together. I like that a lot because it's seeing the whole person and their whole experience outside of just their time in the gym.
Just as a quick kind of sidebar story, really quick. There was one summer when I was younger where I was doing landscaping during the morning and then personal training in the afternoon, evening, and then I was lifting at night. And the landscaping was digging holes. Essentially, we were... If anybody's listening to this, I was doing it with me, Mike and Daniel Frederick, who was one of our clients. That's how we met, actually. We're digging holes pretty much at a volleyball court all day, and then I was going to personal training, then lifting, and my workouts just sucked. I could not handle that much volume. I was also in a fat loss phase at the time, and I would just look at my muscles; they just look super depleted. They didn't have much to give. It just goes to show you that my training in that context needs to be a lot more calculated and organized, a lot smarter compared to, and when I'm not working that kind of role. So it just goes to show you can't just take a training program and put it the same for two people and expect the same result.
To share my own little anecdote, it's nothing like that. But when I was working waitressing jobs, I remember you're walking circles all day, essentially. But I'd come home and lie in bed and my muscles would twitch, my legs would twitch. And that didn't matter what I trained or how I trained or if I trained. It was just they were twitching because they were stimulated all day long. So I think, we live our lives in a way that have demands on our body. And it's so important to recognize what your own individual physical demands are. And I know we're talking about steps here, but steps as a part of a fitness strategy and where they fit into you naturally is the first step before you start thinking about how am I using steps for my fitness goals. It's coming to terms with your own relationship with steps based on your lifestyle, first and foremost, before you do anything else. I think we've done a great job of covering the people whose step counts are high. Let's talk about those who might be a little bit on the lower end right now and are looking to increase their step counts. Before we dive into, theoretical ways we could do that, I'd love to hear from you, and I'll share my experience too, how you actually find steps in your day. What are the ways that you are able to get your steps in?
So right now my steps are around that 6,000 range because they're a lot lower. I'm at almost a peak of my building phase, and my coach is we don't need any more steps here. But I still do use strategies because if I didn't think about it, I wouldn't get in even 6,000 because my job is pretty much right like this all day long, talking to my sister and all of our amazing clients. So the one key strategy I use is a little bit of a warm-up pre and post workout. So I do train 5 days a week right now, and my warm-up is walking on the treadmill for 10 minutes pre and 10 minutes post workout as a warm-up to get the body heat and a cool down. I put it at somewhere around 2.6 speed, and I can rack up quite a bit of steps even just in that. Plus, in between my sets, I usually pace up and down. And then at night, if I call my mom or call you or call Tara or call her dad, who usually his conversations are 1 minute long, in that case, not as helpful for me. I actually walk up and down my condo. So I do that. And the combination of those tend to just give me my steps. However, sometimes if I'm having a day where I am sitting down more and I don't have those things, I'll just go downstairs in my condo building. There's a treadmill, and I'll just do like half an hour, 45 minutes, and just get the rest that I need. When I was in competition prep and my steps were double what they are right now, I would have to do usually 2 intentional walks during the day. And typically that would be in the evening post dinner, or at some point mid morning, I would sneak in another one, a few laps around the block or something.
Nice. That's awesome. Very practical strategies and nothing that really takes you out of routine when you think about it, which I think is kind of nice. It's seamlessly integrated into your natural daily routines. And I would say for me, it's kind of similar. I'm very fortunate that I have a dog. Dogs are the best walking buddies because you have to walk them, right?
No offense to Justin.
No offense to Justin. He's a great walking buddy too. But Toby does a little bit more walking with me. Toby's my puppy. Well, he's not really a puppy. He's 4, but he's always my puppy. So I'm on walking duties with Toby in the morning, which is nice because I always start my day with a walk. And for me, the best thing is I have committed myself to only making my coffee when I get back from the walk. So that's always my reward for getting the walk done, which is nice. So Toby and I go for our morning walks. I'll usually get, maybe 1,500 to 2,000 steps in there, depending on how long our walk is. They're not always the longest walks. And, I kind of bookend my day with another walk at nighttime with Toby and Justin. And we'll kind of walk all together. It's how Justin and I catch up on our days, going for that walk together and taking Toby out. And he often takes Toby for another afternoon walk. So Toby gets more walks than I do. But those are kind of the core strategies. I like bookending my day with that. But admittedly, that's not always going to give me my minimum number of steps that I need just from those 2 walks. So there are a couple other things I do. Right now, my step count actually shot up. So I'm now aiming for 10 to 12,000 a day. So I've also started implementing those warm-ups on the treadmill. But when the weather's okay, I'll actually walk to the gym. And, again, fortunate circumstances. The gym is 2 kilometers almost exactly from my house.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I walk to the gym, it's an efficient way of getting my steps in. It's a little different than walking on the treadmill because if it's sunny out or if it's a nice day or even just having the fresh air is a little bit better than walking on the treadmill. I might not be messaging as much because I shouldn't be on my phone and walking, but that I find is a really useful strategy for me. And I'm going to the gym anyways on those days, so make it happen. There's also a lot of I'm going to call them silly ways, but they're fun that I integrate little steps during my day. And I've heard the term a lot recently, exercise snacks. I'm not sure if you've heard that as well, but exercise snacks is this idea of, if you think about your workout or going for a walk as a meal, your exercise snack is the in-between things that you do to add some movement. I used to be in a role where I was on meetings back to back to back to back to back all day. And often they would be Zoom meetings or Google Meet meetings. And so if there was 5 minutes in between meetings where, I have some time back, maybe I'll get up and walk around for 5 minutes. Right? So that's taking a little exercise snack break. And I think thinking about it that way can help us make it digestible, pardon the pun, to integrate those additional steps. And walking around your condo is great. Putting on music or a podcast can help you kind of get those steps in without even thinking about it. And so leaning on exercise snacks. And I'm going to confess something that's going to sound really ridiculous, but I'm going to just say it anyways. There are days where I get to the end of my day and I'm like, oh my God, I could just benefit from just a little bit more. I will walk around my condo while brushing my teeth at night.
There you go.
It's very simple, but it can give me an extra, 200 steps. I'll take it, right?
Yeah. Honestly, you just have to find creative ways. Every little bit helps. I love that idea of the exercise snacks and exercise meals. And, there was a lot of times where this sounds really bad, but when in prep, when Tara and I were watching Netflix at night, I was like, shoot, I still got 1,500 steps. And I would just book it up and down the condo. Again, not ideal, but in that mindset, you're it's a non-negotiable. It's getting done regardless. Just let me figure out how to do it. And I think a lot of times people need to just adopt that kind of mindset in their fitness journey. Sometimes it's just get it done. You can make as many excuses as you said, I have a lot of meetings, whatever. You can't do 10 minutes in between of walking up and down. You tell me you're back to back from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. with zero lunch or breaks.
I mean, I have been there. I'm not going to lie. But sometimes it's just communicating with the other people around you. Oftentimes you can force yourself to sit there 9 to 5, but that one email that you wrote could have waited an hour. right?
Gotcha.
So like sometimes it's like also, not compromising with yourself and not seeing the barriers, but seeing the opportunity.
Yeah. Or get a walking pad.
Okay, I actually want to make two shout outs here to our two different clients. One of them, actually, the weather was consistently a barrier, and she chose to invest in a walking pad. And I think that was a phenomenal option for her because now she includes it for warm up and cool downs because she works out at home, right? She now has that resource. And also because she's no longer dependent on what's happening outside. She's taking control for herself.
Mm-hmm.
And that small investment pays dividends for overall health and wellness, right? The second client shout out I want to make is a client who yesterday we were talking in our check-in about needing to increase steps. She ended up messaging me at the end of the day being like, I just got 6,000 steps from walking around my living room. I was like, oh my God, what did you do? Like, tell me the secret. She's like, I just put a movie on in the background.
There you go.
And it reminded me of something I feel like is absolutely integral, which is this idea of habit bundling or temptation bundling. You spoke earlier about how when you are on the treadmill, you'll catch up on messages, right? So you're essentially pairing two different actions together, and maybe catching up on messages doesn't sound as enticing, but you can also make sure that you have things that are, accelerating your willingness or your desire to complete the walking mechanisms by giving you something to look forward to. That could be, if you are on a treadmill, putting a movie on your phone or your favorite show or picking a show that you're like, I only watch this when I do my steps. Or it could be a podcast or music or phoning a friend that you haven't talked to in a while. So I think that pairing mechanism is super, super powerful for getting some steps in, habit stacking. Okay, so we have covered off that steps are essentially non-negotiable for your overall health and well-being. It's just the easiest thing you can do to advance your health. Secondly, they have a role in fitness, they're part of energy expenditure, and they're also trackable, which makes it easier for us to kind of set minimums, set targets, measure, keep consistent, and help see progress. And then we've also covered off some of the strategies that we often utilize, what step counts kind of are best for you, how you can interpret your numbers, and how you can start to increase the step counts if you're on the lower side. I think all of that's pretty great stuff, if you don't mind me saying so.
We really stepped it up for this podcast. I was trying to come up with some other ones, but I didn't want to throw in too many.
For me, the more the merrier. I'm not sure how the audience feels, but we started with a pun where I said I'm going to walk you through it, and you just ended with one. That's fantastic.
I was going to say, now I got to go get my steps in so that I can, walk the walk,
Oh,
instead of just talking the talk.
Oh, double whammy. I love it. Okay, so we have one final ask of you guys. Well, the first ask is go get your steps in. The second ask is please subscribe. If you have not already, please subscribe to this podcast. It really helps us out. And while you're down there clicking all those buttons, if you want to drop a comment, that helps too. Let us know if there's any particular topics you want to see us cover, questions you want answered, or if you found value in this podcast. How are you currently getting your step counts up? What are you committing to doing? What do your steps look like? Tell us all about it. We want to hear it. So without further ado, we'll leave it at that for now. And we look forward to chatting with you all again next week. Bye for now.